Happy Friday and well, happy Saturday to our guests. But welcome back to another episode of the DDGeopolitics live stream, 2 days in a row, and we have a big panel for you guys tonight. I'm not even going to introduce them. We're just going to roll right into it. We have Carl Zha and Xiangyu. This is Carl's second time on the show. We have had a wonderful time in the past, and I'm really happy to finally meet Xiangyu after my producer has been hounding me to have him on for about 2 months. So here we are today. And because our listeners keep asking about Korea and reunification of the peninsula, we're going to talk about how Taiwan became the Ukraine for China and what that has to do with the Korean War and how it kind of developed out of that. So how are you guys tonight? Tonight for me. How are you guys this morning?
I thought you missed the opportunity to rename the title to be The Big Trouble in Little China.
I don't even want to talk about it. I didn't even realize it until we came here, and one of the listeners said it, and I was like, "Oh my god, I'm so disappointed." I said, "Big trouble comes in small packages," but then we changed it, and now I wish we would have said Big Trouble in Little China. But yeah, we're going to talk about Taiwan. Is it big trouble for Little China?
No, nothing significant has really changed over the past, I'd say, 7 to 8 decades, or even centuries.
We've been okay for about 80 years. So why don't you guys tell us about what kind of what the climate was like right after World War II, kind of segueing into the Korean War, which was actually, most people don't know in the West that it was actually a UN war. It wasn't an American, well, it was an American war, but it was disguised as a UN war to all of the other nations because they were war weary. So kind of what happened in China during the Korean War?
Well, it's actually important because the Korean War actually ties in to what happened to Taiwan, because because 1949 China was at the tail end of its civil war. Chiang Kai-shek's government had been defeated on mainland China. He withdrew to Taiwan with the rest of his nationalist army, but everybody was expecting Taiwan to fall. Like even many of the KMT officials, people on Taiwan, had expected the communist victory come to Taiwan sooner or later. But what changed was in June 1950, with the outbreak of Korean War, United States President Truman authorized the U.S. 7th Fleet to enter the Taiwan Straits, effectively intervene in a Chinese civil war. And that's what saved Chiang Kai-shek's ass on Taiwan. And that ended up with a separation for Taiwan from mainland China that remained till this day, 70 years separation. And go ahead.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Chiang Kai-shek? Because he was palling around with some of the European fascists towards the end of World War II. I believe he hung out with Franco. He definitely hung out with Bandera from Ukraine, and maybe even Ante Pavlich from. So was he really a fascist, or was it? What was his kind of political ideology, or maybe his platform?
I think Carl can get into it a little bit more, but I think during that time, in many parts of the world, fascism and communism were looked to as different alternatives and potential paths. And it says a lot that Chiang Kai-shek sent his biological son, Jiang Jingguo, to the Soviet Union to study for 12 years, while his adopted son was sent to Nazi Germany. So
yeah, I mean, Chiang Kai-shek has always been he's an opportunist, but he also liked to be fashionable. He was working with the Soviet Union in the early 1920s when Soviet Union sponsored KMT, and later when he made his break with the communists, especially after 1927 Shanghai massacre, where he purged 5,000 union workers, communists, sympathizers, anybody suspected to be communist in Shanghai. That's when he lost the support of the Soviet Union. So he turned toward Nazi Germany. China had a commercial relationship with Germany prior to Nazi coming to power, because Germany, after the Treaty of Versailles, their industry have been severely curtailed. I mean, their arms industry doesn't have a market. But China was in its warlords period, and it has a lot of demand for German weapons. So the German manufacturers got their ass saved by coming to the Chinese market and selling German weapons to China, and that relationship carried over when Hitler took power in Germany, and Chiang Kai-shek actually hired a German advisor from Nazi Germany to train KMT army. This was a time when he was waging the war on the communists. Mao had established a base in southern China, so the German advisor to Chiang Kai-shek enabled the KMT multiple extermination campaigns against the communists. But Chiang Kai-shek is also admired of the ideology of Mussolini and then later Hitler, because he thought, okay, this could be one way of bringing China to consolidate China under his control, under his power. But he's not a really I remember there's a Chinese dissident at that time who said Chiang Kai-shek. Do you remember Xiangyu? He said 独裁无能，民主独裁无胆, and something. It's like basically saying he's too chicken. He's too chicken to go to become a full dictator. Like his idols. And in Nazi Germany, but it's also because China wasn't a centralized state the way Germany and Italy was. There were many warlords. He has to contend for power, and also there was a communist party. So this is kind of the in 1930s, 1920s, a lot of things were in flux, like Xiangyu referred to. People are flirting with all kind of different ideologies. Like the United States was a role model for Dr. Sun Yat-sen with the founding of the Republic of China. But what happened was during World War One, the United States wanted China to join the war on the Allied side because the Allies were running out of manpower. All the men were sent to the front, and they need people to man the factories. So both United States and UK want China to join on the war against Germany, Austria-Hungary, and what China did, what United States did was promise China that if they join the war on the Allied side, they will return the German Chinese colony of Qingdao back to China at the end of the war. But at the same time, United States made a deal with Japan that will allow Japan to take the German colony of Qingdao in China. So after World War One, there was a Treaty of Versailles. China sent its official representative to Versailles, and this is where Chinese interest was betrayed, because the prior agreement between United States and Japan, the German colony of Qingdao was given to Japan. Now this was revealed by the Soviets, because the Soviets, they inherited all the Russian archives, so they knew all the deals that happened between all the great powers. They knew the British and the French were dividing up the Middle East, and they knew that they're going to betray China and give the German colony of Qingdao to Japan. So they leak all the documents and especially leak all the secret deals to the Chinese representative in Versailles. And that news traveled back to China. It raised a huge protest on May 4th, 1919. And this is when a lot of the people, especially young people, got disillusioned with Western liberalism, and especially with their previous infatuation with the United States, and they started to seek alternative ideologies, and communism was one of them. A lot of the people, Mao, for example, were influenced by the May 4th movement. That's when the Chinese Communist Party started to be formed. Chiang Kai-shek was flirting with his own brand of, fascist ideology, but in 1940. to fast forward a couple of decades, at the end of the surrender of Japan in 1945, there was still a lot of area in China under Japanese occupation. Most of the Chiang Kai-shek's army, nationalist army, is camped in the southwest part of China, whereas the communists have established many rural bases all over China, especially in the northern China. They're closest to all the big cities that's still controlled by the Japanese Imperial Army. The United States has its own plans for the post-war East Asia. You wanted Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist China to act as a deputy for the U.S. empire, the way that later Japan picked up that role. But originally, Roosevelt's vision was for China to be U.S. junior partner in East Asia to hold off the Soviet influence. And the United States didn't want the communists to take over northern China. So what they did is they start shipping the U.S. after World War II. The largest military operation U.S. was involved in was called Operation Beleaguer. They sent 60,000 troops to China, including Marines and Navy. And their main goal was to help shipping Chiang Kai-shek's army from southwestern China to northern China, where they will take over from the surrendering Japanese army to race against the clock, against the communists. And at the same time, the Soviet, after August Storm 1945, the Soviet Union took over much of Manchuria from the Japanese Kwangtung Army. And the communists took the opportunity at this time to enter Manchuria to take over a lot of the administration, because Soviet Red Army has no interest in administering Chinese cities. So they hand over all the Chinese cities they control to the communist administration. And for both Chiang Kai-shek and United States, that was not acceptable. So U.S. started trying to ship nationalist troops to Manchuria. And this is when this made Soviets set up and took notice, because before the end of the war, Stalin signed the Sino-Soviet Friendship Treaty in August 1945. And one of the stipulation is the Soviet will maintain the naval base in Port Arthur in the city of Dalian. And Soviet will have its trade privileges in Manchuria. When Soviets saw the U.S. 7th Fleet was shipping Chiang Kai-shek's forces closer and closer to Manchuria, Soviet felt like Chiang Kai-shek is becoming a U.S. proxy, and this is going to infringe upon the Soviet privilege in Manchuria. So they start to switch their support to the Chinese communists. That eventually led to the Chinese Civil War. This is kind of facet of early Cold War between U.S. and Soviet Union. The communists won out, and then the Chiang Kai-shek had to flee to Taiwan. So in 1949, the communists in China were still focused on basically to chase out nationalists from all of Chinese territory. Their minds weren't even on Korea yet, but Korea has
helped, didn't they? Didn't they help the communists win the Civil War?
Well, what happened is when the Soviet came in at the end of the World War II in August 1945, during August Storm, the 1 million strong Red Army very quickly took over Manchuria, and they advanced into northern Korea. But United States had a prior agreement. So United States very quickly went to Soviet Union because they didn't want the Soviet to take over the entire Korean Peninsula. So they actually went to the Soviets and asked them to stop at the 38th parallel. But Soviet agreed. Soviet agreed to the plan. The Soviet Red Army actually stopped at their 38th parallel. So what happened is below the 38th parallel, the southern half of the Korean Peninsula was still occupied by the Japanese. They were to wait for the arrival of the Americans. And the Americans did arrive. Then this partition of Korea was supposed to be temporary. This wasn't just like partitioning of Germany after World War II. This, which is a very temporary, it was never intended to set up two different states on the Korean Peninsula. And at that time, the Korean people themselves, they start organizing. There was a attempt to set up the People's Republic of Korea, but United States government didn't like that. They quickly disbanded that government. Most of the people who were involved fled to north to form the government in Pyongyang, and the United States had found its own proxy, Syngman Rhee, to be the head of the South Korean government. Now, there was supposed to be an all Korean election for a new government, but that never happened because United States wouldn't allow it. They want and people in the Southern Korea, they were expecting liberation from the Japanese and from the Japanese collaborators. So what happened was the Japanese left, but all the Japanese collaborators were left in place in the government, and so they were kind of bewildered. It's like, well, what happened? Well, where's the liberation? And this is when there were several maybe Xiangyu can pick it up from here. There were several uprisings in Southern Korea that were later was put down by the American proxies because they didn't want to see a unified Korea. They didn't want to. They wanted to prolong the occupation of Southern Korea. They wanted to making the partition into a permanent state of affair. But both North and both North and South Korean government in 1950, they want a unified Korea. They want a unified Korea under their own government. Syngman Rhee from the South, he wanted to unify. He wanted to push North to unify Korea under his rule, and North Korea, DPRK under Kim Il-sung wanted to push South to reunify South Korea, to unify all of Korea under the communist rule. So the Civil War was already brewing before it officially broke out in June 1950. There were several uprisings in the South Korea that was brutally suppressed. And people like to say, oh, on June 1950, North Korea started Korean Wars. This is actually not true. Both sides were planning for a conflict that will see a unified Korea, which is a matter of time when the conflict breaks out. China did help because China had during the Chinese Civil War, there was one of the major battleground was Manchuria, and Manchuria had a good several million Korean population, and from this several million Korean population, there were about 60,000 Koreans who signed up for the People's Liberation Army. And in 1950, when Kim Il-sung had his plan to reunify Korea, he approached Mao Zedong. He said, "Okay, I know you have 60,000 Korean soldiers in the PLA. They have helped to liberate China. Now we also like to have them to help liberate their homeland." And the deal was done that the 60,000 Korean soldiers from the People's Liberation Army then were transferred to DPRK. They became officially part of the Korean Army, and that boosted the military strength of DPRK suddenly to over 100,000. And that they actually formed along with the Soviet Koreans, they formed kind of the backbone in the early phase of the Korean War.
So can you tell us a little bit about maybe, it's funny because we want to talk about Taiwan being the Ukraine of Asia. We entered into another Ukraine of Asia, which is South Korea, the forever occupied South Korea. I don't think that people understand that South Korea has no control over their military and is literally just a colony of the United States. Can you talk a little bit about Stalin's kind of hesitancy, and then he eventually sent the generals into North Korea for an advisory status, and he was still kind of like iffy, and then but then they got involved.
Well, I mean, Stalin wanted coexistence with U.S. after World War II because the Soviet Union have suffered greatly from a great loss of manpower. The Soviet Union wanted to concentrate on reconstruction of the Soviet Union. This is why Stalin made a lot of compromises all over the world, including Greece, from Greece to Korea. I mean, this is why they decide to, okay, if the Soviet Red Army, if they wanted to, they could easily push further south in August, September of 1945. I mean, there was no resistance, but they abided by the agreement they had with Americans. You know, the Americans at the last minute, they realized, okay, if they don't stop the Soviet, if they don't tell the Soviet to stop, the Soviet just gonna take over the entire Korean Peninsula, and that threatens the planned occupation of Japan, because United States wanted to make sure Japan remain with its own sphere of influence post-war. And that later U.S. would include Taiwan as part of. In 1949, there was a debate between the U.S. military and the U.S. State Department. The U.S. military wanted United States to intervene in the Chinese Civil War on behalf of Chiang Kai-shek, because U.S. 7th Fleet had its headquarters in Qingdao after 1945. And they wanted to maintain their headquarters in China. They didn't want it, so they want U.S. to participate in the Chinese Civil War, just so the U.S. 7th Fleet can keep its headquarters in Qingdao. That didn't happen. The U.S. State Department actually was ready to abandon Chiang Kai-shek because they saw it was they saw it was a hopeless cause. But what they had planned was they had planned a military coup on Taiwan to replace Chiang Kai-shek with a more pliant, a more pro-American military leader. They picked General Sun Lizhen, who studied in the West Virginia Military Academy, and he had him. Sun Lizhen actually met MacArthur in Japan shortly after, and MacArthur officially made him that offer. So, like, okay, we're thinking about making you the leader of Taiwan, replacing Chiang Kai-shek. Sun Lizhen didn't, he declined. But this news got filtered back to Chiang Kai-shek. So the Taiwan regime was on very rocky ground from the period of 1949 to 1950. But the Korean War changed that, because that's when suddenly the State Department and the U.S. Pentagon suddenly their vision got unified, and they decided they got to keep Taiwan from being controlled by the communists. MacArthur referred Taiwan as a unsinkable aircraft carrier, off the coast of China, and that's why United States intend to keep Taiwan under its control. And this is and at that time, the U.S. had got this anti-communist bug on its brain. Everything can be justified. So this led to the direct U.S. military intervention in the Korean Civil War. It's important to point that out. Korean War started out as the Civil War. U.S. is the one that decided to intervene in a civil war in Korea, and they got UN to authorize so-called UN forces, because at that time the Soviet walked out over I forgot what was the occasion. The Soviet representative walked out over a different issue at the time. So U.S. took the opportunity of the Soviet absence from the Security Council to push through the resolution to authorize the UN forces in Korea, and that's what happened.
And I want to ask Xiangyu, because he mentioned prior to when we started that his family actually has familial ties to the Korean War. So what can you tell us about your family, how they got involved, and what you know about kind of their experiences there?
Well, they weren't there to fight in the war, that's for sure. My paternal grandfather was from Shandong province, which was very impoverished when he was born, because he was born on the final year of the Qing dynasty, because he didn't have my dad until he was 50. Anyways, it was very popular at the time for people in Shandong to become migrant workers and go to China's northeast to be migrant workers and do hard labor. And at that time, the Northeast and Korea were under Japanese occupation. So some of them ended up trying to seek opportunities in Korea, where there also was a Chinese community, mostly from Shandong. So they would just fit right in. So he and his brother went to Heechun in Chagang province, which is in North Korea. And then sometime before 1945, my grandfather went to Seoul, and he worked there as he was a woodworker and then eventually became some sort of merchant. But fun fact, if you see a lot of brick buildings in South Korea, a lot of them were built by Chinese migrant workers hired by the Japanese during the Japanese colonization. So the war broke out. I mean, after 1945, my grandfather couldn't go back to Korea because there was the 38th parallel there, and he lost contact with his older brother for the rest of his life. But we're back in contact now because the Chinese community is pretty tight knit, and our relatives on mainland China ended up looking for them. So his older brother's family in Chagang in North Korea had their entire town bombed by the US. So they went in hiding, and they were found by the Chinese People's Volunteers. And when the volunteers found out that they were Chinese, they were like, hey, you need to go back to China. So they began their journey back to China on foot for like a whole month on foot, I think, or more. And they could only move at night because anything that moved during the day was fair game for, US bombings. And what really changed my mind about the Western media's portrayal of the Korean War when I was a late teenager was how, I mean, my grandfather, I never met him because he passed away before I was born, but he never was that political. He wasn't a communist sympathizer or anything. He was just a Chinese dude who was bitter about not ever being able to go back to China. So yeah, I mean, he and my dad would sometimes, because they want to hear news from home, so they would go and listen to shortwave radio at night in secret. This was very risky to do in South Korea at the time, to listen to broadcasts from mainland China, from Beijing, to kind of just keep up with what's going on back home. And of course, they would also get some North Korean broadcasts. But my dad eventually told me that my grandfather told him that during the Korean War, the Korean People's Army and the Chinese People's Volunteers were helpful to the people and did not interfere with their daily lives, whereas the Americans were very intrusive. Yeah, so that was kind of a huge turning point in my political development, hearing that side of the story from somebody who's not even a communist. Now, I think earlier on in our conversation, it's something I want to get back into, was how, understandably, when you wanted to talk about, hey, let's talk about Taiwan, you began the conversation by asking questions about Chiang Kai-shek, which is understandable. But I think the reason why I started my podcast called Straight Talk with Xiangyu is because I really want to let people know that to understand the geopolitics in this region, you cannot look at Taiwan's beginning as 1949 or even 1945. I'll give an example. Why did China enter the Korean War? I mean, it's not like something similar hadn't happened in the past. If you look at the first Sino-Japanese War, which resulted in China losing Taiwan to the Japanese in the humiliating Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895, it was largely a war fought between Chinese and Japanese forces on Korea. I mean, some of the fighting happened elsewhere, but a lot of the fighting happened in Korea. So Korea serves as a land bridge for Japan or the Western powers into the Eurasian continent. Whereas Taiwan, if you look on a map, it's part of a huge island chain. It's right dead in the middle of the chain that starts in the Aleutian Islands all the way down to the South China Sea, looping back up to Southeast Asia. So the US keeping control of Taiwan is integral for maintaining its encirclement of China, because if Chinese reunification happens, then that means China has unfettered access to the Pacific Ocean. So even in 1949, before the establishment of the People's Republic of China, so that happened in October, all the way back in February, when the writing was on the wall that the KMT would lose control over the mainland, they were already some factions of the U.S. I mean, like Carl mentioned, there were some disagreements within the U.S. government internally, but on how to reckon with the situation, how to approach the new incoming Chinese government, how to how to make sense of it. And the consensus at that point was we just got to do whatever we can to keep Taiwan from being under control of the communists. And so in February, the U.S. sent a diplomat. He was sent by the then Secretary of State Atchison. I think his name was Livingston T. Merchant. He was sent to Taiwan to talk to the provincial governor, Chen Cheng, and he offered him a deal saying, hey, if you declare independence, separate yourself from the central government and on the mainland, declare a separate country, we'll support you, and then we will send in UN forces, and then we'll do a little national foundation ceremony. And then when Chiang Kai-shek loses the civil war, he has to come to Taiwan as like a separate Taiwan that's separate from China as a political refugee, and not, what happened, which was Chiang Kai-shek came to Taiwan with Taiwan being the last stronghold of China that hadn't fallen to the communists. You see the difference there?
Correct. So, yeah. I kind of ask how we got a foothold there, but that makes sense as kind of like being like, we'll keep this island out of the sphere of the PRC.
Yeah, because the US. Go on.
Oh, okay. I was going to mention, even before Korean War broke out, before the official U.S. policy switched to keep Taiwan out of the grasp of the communists, the U.S. military was conducting its own diplomacy in East Asia. They sent the former commander of the U.S. 7th Fleet, Charles Cook, to Taiwan to act as a military advisor to Chiang Kai-shek. And one of the roles Charles Cook did was to acquire weapons for Chiang Kai-shek, sourcing. They formed a lot of the shell companies to purchase U.S. military equipment left over from World War II to ship them over to Taiwan. And this was done when, at the time, even this is a whole separate Pentagon effort. Charles Cook, he only reported to MacArthur in Japan. And it's after Korean War, that's when officially United States throw its support to Taiwan. They had the CIA. They had a CIA front company in Taiwan called the West Corporation, and that was funneling arms and training to Taiwan. So, sorry, Xiangyu, I just got
that's kind of what I want to get into, because like we get through this Korean War and they kind of give Taiwan over to this Chiang Kai-shek, and then they start using it kind of as like a springboard to attack a lot of Southeastern Asian countries and to use it for things for the Vietnam War. So what did Taiwan kind of serve as in the 50s and 60s and maybe 70s for the United States?
You basically summarized it pretty well. It's so to really understand this question, we have to go back and ask the question, why did the previous colonizers all want Taiwan? The Dutch wanted it, the Spanish wanted it, the Japanese took it, and why does America want it now? I'll tell you why. The Japanese wanted it because of its once again, its geopolitical position. It's right off the coast of mainland China, and it's also dead in the center between mainland China, Japan, and Southeast Asia, which the Pacific Islands, which Japan wanted to, both of which the Japanese wanted to take over. The Spanish wanted it because it's next to the Philippines and off the coast of mainland China. They had their colony in the Philippines, right? And the Dutch wanted it because back then they had their base in Batavia and what is now Indonesia. And it also serves as a convenient location for trade with the Chinese mainland. And I think one important thing to understand is when you're asking how did Chiang Kai-shek get Taiwan, it's almost as if, and I'm not saying this to say like, oh, why don't you know this or anything. It's a very common misunderstanding because to most people, Taiwan didn't become relevant until 1949. So people's understanding of Taiwan begins in 1949. But did you know that Taiwan's been a part of Chinese civilization for centuries, for longer than the US has been around? So it's not a matter of, oh, how did he just found a new country? He didn't.
No. I didn't mean that. Sorry.
I know you didn't. I'm just saying. I'm saying it's a common misconception. So basically, Chiang Kai-shek has one talent. That is, he may not be the favorite guy of people around him, but he's always able to make it so that, hey, when shit hits the fan, he's the only person that they can pick. That's the case with the Americans. So with the Americans, he essentially made a deal with the devil, because America didn't really, at that point, wasn't supportive of him reunifying China. You had to know Chiang Kai-shek was against Taiwan separatism. He just also didn't like communists. So the idea was, okay, we're going to muster our forces in Taiwan and eventually take over the mainland. Of course, after the mainland got nukes, that wasn't realistic. But even before then, the US knew that would be a suicide mission. The US was like, okay, sending the Seventh Fleet to the Taiwan Strait was not just about preventing the communists from coming over here. It was also about preventing Chiang Kai-shek from going back over there, because first of all, he get destroyed and totally annihilated. But second of all, that would severely damage the stability in the region. Like I said, the US at that point was primarily interested in maintaining the integrity of the first island chain, which was why the US planted a lot of coal mines for, not coal mines, planted a lot of landmines for Taiwan separatism to arise. And the goal of it is never to, the US doesn't care about actual Taiwan sovereignty or Taiwan independence. It's just about maintaining its geopolitical influence in the region. So the first time, so in 1950, the US and a bunch of other countries signed a treaty in San Francisco with the Japanese for the final peace settlements. Now, China was one of the victorious victor countries. So you'd think that China would be present at the signing of the treaty, right? But China wasn't. And the contention was, some thought that Beijing should be the representative of China, whilst others thought, well, it was fought with the KMT, it should be the Chiang Kai-shek regime in Taipei. So the US was like, okay, we're just going to leave them totally out. And in the Potsdam Declaration and Cairo declarations, like that were declared towards the end of the Civil War, towards the end of World War II, it was basically pointed out that Japan would give all Chinese territories taken through unequal treaties and through Japanese aggression back to China, and it specifically names Taiwan and the pescadores. The pescadores is the Western name for Penghu. So, and this was also referenced in Japan's instruments of surrender, but it was totally left out of the San Francisco Treaty. So the U.S. could now argue, oh yeah, Chiang Kai-shek on Taiwan, we're not really, we don't recognize necessarily that Taiwan has been given back to the Republic of China. It's only been surrendered by Japan, and we're just letting him administer Taiwan until the situation settled. But this theory of undetermined status was basically destroyed by Taipei, by Chiang Kai-shek in a series of negotiations, which is why Chiang Kai-shek, he's a bastard. Chinese people in general don't like him, but at the end of the day, he's our bastard. Because when he tried to make a deal with the devil to further himself, but when push came to shove, he did not go all the way. He did not separate China into two countries. He did not go on with the plans of Taiwan independence, Taiwan separatism. So when the US and Taipei concluded a treaty, it was called the Sino-American Mutual Defense Treaty. Basically, the US at that point recognized the Republic of China and recognized Taiwan and Penghu as territory of the Republic of China. Now, this is significant because this basically negates the design in San Francisco, where they were like, oh yeah, Taiwan status is undetermined. It's not legally part of the Republic of China. Well, now it is according to your own laws, and you're concluding this treaty with the Republic of China, and the Republic of China considers itself to be the sole legitimate government of all of China, with Taiwan as 1/1000th of its territory. So, but there's this compromise. The compromise is the U.S. basically told Chiang Kai-shek, if you want to make moves against the mainland, you can only do so with our approval. And Chiang Kai-shek also was upset with the Mutual Defense Treaty because it defined the so-called Republic of China's territory as Taiwan and the Pescadores. It did not include the Chinese mainland, which Chiang Kai-shek wanted he wanted that. So it was kind of a both sides had to compromise a little bit. Now, what's interesting is there's more territory under Taipei's control to this day that falls outside of Taiwan and Penghu. It's Jinmen and Mazu, which are both, they're on the other side of the Taiwan Strait, like within a stone's throw distance of the mainland. Now, they're purposely left unliberated by the communists, because if you liberate them, then the distance between the two sides becomes the entire width of the Taiwan Strait, whereas if those sides are left unliberated and under Taipei's control, the physical distance between the two regimes ends up being a mere like 1 to 2 miles. So in order to test the US's determination of defending the Chiang Kai-shek regime, the Chinese mainland started shelling Jinmen Island. Now this kind of saved Chiang Kai-shek as well. It ended up being kind of a tacit cooperation between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, believe it or not, because at that point the U.S. wanted Chiang Kai-shek to pull troops out of Jinmen and Mazu to, widen the distance between the two sides, and if not create a one China, one Taiwan situation, at least create a two China situation. Now Chiang Kai-shek was looking for a reason to keep his troops stationed there, and the communist shelling gave him that reason. And the U.S. was like, yeah, we're gonna send nukes, we're gonna drop nukes if you guys attack Jinmen, and Mao kind of called their bluff. So yeah, there's a lot of history going on here, and just a lot of contradictions on Taiwan, whether it be, because you keep in mind, Taiwan was under 50 years of Japanese occupation, whereas the rest of China did not. So when the KMT first arrived in 1945, 50 years it's not a short time. It's not enough time to totally change the culture here, but it's enough time for there to be mutual misunderstandings, especially due to the fact that up until 1945, most of Taiwan's population descended from southern Fujian, and there's a Hakka minority from Meixian in Guangdong province. But now all of a sudden you have people from all over the Chinese mainland, from like north, south, east, west, speaking all sorts of different dialects that they couldn't understand. And I mean, you have to understand, before the entire Chinese population became fluent in standard Mandarin, regional cultures were very strong, because you would go to some villager in some middle of nowhere place in like Qinghai would not be able to communicate orally if he went to, say, Beijing. So there's that. And of course, for US geopolitical interests, it's willing to take advantage of all of these antagonisms and contradictions to ensure that Taiwan does not get too close with the mainland. So yeah, it's just the story of burying a lot of landmines and erupting them. And then, I think a really important thing to note, because because Carl mentioned how the U.S. tried to coup Chiang Kai-shek. Well, that was a failed attempt, but you know what did not fail was, it was then that the U.S. realized, hey, there are people in Taiwan who are starting to call for Taiwan separatism. Now, back then, this was a very, very niche, like, ideology that was not in the mainstream. But the U.S. realized, hey, you had these people. They were kind of left out of the power centers once the KMT took over Taiwan, and they were sour about it because during the Japanese era, they were basically given a lot of power as collaborators. So at this point, they were like, oh yeah, we don't like the KMT. We want Taiwan independence. We want to create a new Taiwan and be the bosses of our own so-called country. So the U.S., when it overtly supported Chiang Kai-shek, it covertly supported the separatists as attack dogs on a leash, so that if Chiang Kai-shek wasn't being cooperative, they could just loosen up the leash a little bit. Now, ever since the 1990s, the KMT's effectively been hollowed out. And ever since from 2000 to 2008, and then from 2016 to the present, Taiwan's been under the administration of the opposition party, the Democratic Progressive Party. And the Democratic Progressive Party today is essentially used by the US as attack dogs against the CPC. The policy was simple. It was to have controlled opposition against Chiang Kai-shek, and then use Chiang Kai-shek as opposition against the Chinese communists. And then the hope was to win over the Chinese communists from the Soviets and use the Chinese communists to get to the Soviet Union. Now you can argue that that did happen to a certain extent, but yeah, they were very strategic about it.
Well, what about the martial law period? So wasn't Taiwan under some sort of martial law during the Korean War and then following? And that's, I mean, that was kind of a regime that the United States also loved, but the people didn't.
Martial law on Taiwan actually started in 1947. It is because, as Xiangyu mentioned, after Taiwan returned back to China, KMT sent its own official, its own army to take over Taiwan. Now, this process is very corrupt. This process also happened in the rest of China. What the KMT would do is, because Japan, during its occupation of China, they confiscated a lot of the properties. That became the property of the Japanese Imperial Army and the collaborators. When the KMT came, what they did is they took over these properties and then made it their own personal property. I mean, so you can imagine there's a lot of corruption. This is why a lot of people, they thought, oh, okay, we have liberation. We finally kick out the Japanese. And the KMT, then they saw these KMT carpetbaggers come and they're reaping all the material benefits from all the loots that accumulated by the Japanese. And then because immediately after Japanese surrender, Chiang Kai-shek launched the Chinese Civil War. It's too important to remember. It wasn't the communists that started the Chinese Civil War. It was Chiang Kai-shek, because Chiang Kai-shek believed he had the numerical advantage, he had the firepower, he could win. But China, after its devastation of the Japanese occupation, then immediately plunged into the Chinese Civil War. This caused hyperinflation. And so all these problems is compounded in Taiwan because of the 50-year separation of Taiwan from mainland. So it was sufficiently different. They saw all these people who came from different cultural background from mainland. Many of them don't speak the local dialect in Taiwan, are imposing their will on Taiwan. So there was a widespread, there was a particular a trigger for the protest was when the KMT were cracking down on so everything got centralized through KMT. So they were cracking down people selling unlicensed cigarettes. And one of the KMT tax collector beat up this old woman selling cigarettes in Taiwan. And this triggered a huge riot. And certainly the riot turns into an anti-KMT movement. This was the February 28th incident, it's called in Taiwan. And the KMT fear it's losing Taiwan. They sent its army to Taiwan to put down the rebellion. And there was a lot of bloodshed. And from that point on, from 1947, Taiwan was under martial law, and it didn't get lifted until 1987. So Taiwan was under 40-year period of martial law. It's also called the White Terror because KMT will use this opportunity to arrest anyone who is suspected of either being communist or communist sympathizers. They can arrest anybody on any pretense. And this is throughout this whole period, Taiwan had the full backing of the United States because, as Xiangyu mentioned, U.S. envisioned the so-called first island chain that stretched from the Aleutian Islands all the way through Japan, Okinawa, Taiwan, Philippines, and Malaysia, Indonesia as the containment of communism of both China and Soviet Union. And so that means, United States also said Chiang Kai-shek about being our bastard. They have to support Chiang Kai-shek because Chiang Kai-shek is anti-communist, and Chiang Kai-shek's United States supported anti-communist dictators all over Asia. Taiwan is just one of them.
You know what I really like that you guys both said it. It's a continuation of the Aleutian Islands, which we don't think of it that way, and it's it's more beneficial to just look at it as like a holistic island chain, separate or like kind of just different nations as you come down, and then you can view it more so as the United States kind of slicing right in through the middle of that. And I don't think that people realize that it is this contiguous chain of islands all the way up through Japan. I don't think that they understand like really what they're Americans, so I mean they don't really.
Well, today one of the main reason that the U.S. Pentagon and U.S. Planners are arguing is that we cannot have mainland China resume control of Taiwan because that will allow the Chinese Navy access to the Western Pacific. And right now the Chinese Navy, they have to pass through the Ryukyu Islands, through Okinawa, if Taiwan, the unsinkable aircraft carrier, get taken over by China, then China can launch its projection of power into Western Pacific, whereas there's a lot of U.S. colonies. You have Guam, you have Hawaii. You can't have that. You can't have the Chinese Navy in the Western Pacific. So this is one of the publicly stated reason they say why U.S. must, hold Taiwan, hold the communists off from Taiwan.
Okay, what can you tell us more about? Okay, so 1988, Chiang Kai-shek he dies, and his party.
He died in 1975.
I'm sorry, Chiang Ching-kuo, and then Lee Teng-hui became the first president of Taiwan, born in Taiwan, and but that party, the KMT party, stayed in power until what, 2000?
Yes.
And then you had your first non-KMT president. And then you have China also debuts a policy around that time about one country on each side. What was that policy?
Oh, no. Oh, the debuted it was Taipei debuted a policy. It was actually written by the current leader, Tsai Ing-wen, when she was a staff member of Li Denghui's cabinet.
And what was it? Obviously, Taiwan. Go ahead.
So,
Carl,
both Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek and his son Jiang Jingguo, and also mainland China government all insisted there's only one China, but we are the legitimate government of all of China, including Taiwan. This is what U.S. has recognized in the Shanghai Communique when Nixon signed with Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, which says United States recognize the Chinese position that Taiwan is part of China, and Beijing is the sole legal representative of all of China. And what the line that Li Denghui tried to push in the 1990s when he came to power is, well, there's actually two Chinas. There's the People's Republic of China, and this is a Republic of China, and the Republic of China is on Taiwan. And this is what view as separatism on mainland China. They feel like this is de facto creating, basically two states. And this actually during 1992, the representative of both sides met. I think it was in Singapore. That came to the 1992 consensus. Do you want to talk about that, Xiangyu?
The 1992 consensus was basically two leaders meeting, because this was around the time when cross-strait travel started resuming, and because before the policy of the KMT with the communists was no contact, no negotiations, and no compromise. But as fate would have it, in 1987, this one former U-2 pilot who was from the mainland. So you had to be like a top level pilot to be a U-2 pilot, by the way. He's part of the Black Cat Squadron, so very elite pilot. Basically, he wanted to go back to the mainland. And at this point, he was a commercial pilot. So he waited until one day when he had a cargo flight. So because if you hijack a passenger flight, that's a pretty bad look. So he waited until he had to do a cargo flight. And what he did was he subdued his crew members. And then the plane was supposed to be headed first to I think it was from Thailand to Hong Kong and then to Taiwan. I think it was originally Singapore to Thailand, Thailand to whatever. The important thing is, during the segment that was intended to fly to Hong Kong, he subdued his crew members and then flew to Guangdong province on the mainland. and he was received as a hero. And that was a very bad look. And he was like, no, I want to stay here. I'm defecting. But then because there was the plane, there were the staff members on the plane, and there was the cargo that needed to come back to Taiwan, it forced it forced the government on Taiwan to send representatives to Hong Kong to negotiate with the Beijing authorities. So that effectively broke the three no's policy of no contact, no negotiations, and no compromise, because there's contact and there's negotiations. Now, it was also during that time, because you had to realize most of the people who arrived to Taiwan in 1949 were soldiers who were really young. A lot of them were impressed in the army, didn't really want to even come to Taiwan. Some of them joined the military because they wanted to fight the Japanese. Others joined because they needed food. And during this whole time, they couldn't go back to the mainland because it was still in a state of civil war. So, but around this time, they started protesting, saying, "Hey, our parents are dying. Our we miss our families. We really want to go back and visit." But the government didn't really do anything about it. But after this hijacking, the government started feeling more pressure from all sides, because this was also when the separatist movement was at its or the liberal opposition movement. It was not yet explicitly separatist, so there were separatist elements, was at its peak. So starting in 1987. Yeah, 1987. Okay, so the hijacking happened in 1986. I'm misremembering. 1987. Originally, it was if you had relatives within 3 degrees, either directly or through marriage. So let's say I was a Taiwanese woman married to a mainlander, mainland soldier, a veteran, and the veteran had family on the mainland, I would be allowed to go as well. Or if you had a spouse on the mainland, you're allowed to travel there. And then eventually they wanted to kind of normalize relations so that there could be investments, there could be more cross-strait travel. But then to do that, you needed to get some general guidelines. What is our relationship between these two governments? Because we don't recognize each other, and we both claim to be the legitimate government of China. Well, 1992 consensus was we both agree that China is one country and that we will work towards reunification. It doesn't define what China is, but it just says that we agree that there is one China, which gives enough of a gray area for the KMT to say in Taiwan, well, one China means the Republic of China. So you get what I'm saying? So it's kind of it's a legal loophole of sorts for the two sides to resume contact while not recognizing each other, and because mutual recognition would mean two countries, right? See, this is what people don't get. People are like, some pro-China Westerners are like, oh, see, look, this is the official map of the so-called Republic of China. It includes all the mainland. They lost the Civil War. Why can't they get over it? Well, if the so-called Republic of China drops the claims over the mainland on the official map, how do you think Beijing would take it? They would be like, oh, you're trying to create two countries now, huh? And to them, that would be like separatism. And Mongolia's on the map too, long story. But Mongolia can't really be removed either, because once you remove Mongolia, it sets precedents for removing more territories from the map. And separatists, if they cannot overthrow the so-called Republic of China and establish a Republic of Taiwan, they will settle for, well, just redefining the Republic of China.
But redefining it as what?
Republic of China on Taiwan.
Okay, and one of our listeners actually asked, so I'm going to just throw a curveball. What about Fallon and Gong? Because I know that their biggest population outside of Taiwan or outside of China is in Taiwan and Canada. Which, you know what, Canada, Canada. Everybody, sleeps on Canada, but I will. Canada, I'm coming for you too, because you guys harbor all kinds of terrorists: Ukrainians, Khalistanis, Turkestan. And Falun Gong. So how did Falun Gong get to Taiwan? And are they kind of also are they cultivated by the United States as well in the West?
People keep on, in the West,
real quick.
talking about.
Sorry, real quick. Gonna be a little bit autistic right now. The Falun Gong in Taiwan is not the biggest population outside of China. It's the biggest Falun Gong gathering outside of mainland China. It's still in China.
Yeah, that is autistic. You knew what I meant.
Thank you.
I know.
Thank you. But thank you.
Does he do this to you too, Carl? When you two? I'm just kidding.
So people in the West keep on talking about the Chinese propaganda everywhere. the most successful Chinese propaganda in the world today is run by Falun Gong. Epoch Times under Falun Gong, they're like one of the largest media organizations in the United States right now. This is by far the most of a successful Chinese propaganda I know in the English language world. And
we had a friend the other day that was wandering around a rec center in Canada, in Toronto, and stumbled upon a Falun Gong meeting and tried to get into it, and they kicked him out and like freaked out.
And they have huge like YouTube following, China Uncensored. That is a Falun Gong media channel for people who don't know. and so, they are hugely successful. So they started out as a cult inside China. At that time, there were different Qigong cults in the late 1980s. And Chinese government didn't pay mind to them until Jiang Zemin era in 1990s, and that's when they acquired a substantial following. The way they recruit people is actually like cults everywhere. They go recruit like old grandmas trying to exercise in the park. They say, "Oh, we are an exercise group. We're trying to help you to cultivate your qi, your inner qi." And
if you look at their demographics, they're 75% women. So once you see that something is that disproportionately women, you have to say that's a cult because they're going to hit on vulnerable people. Like that's a cult. The women are more susceptible to cults. I don't care any of the women in the chat. We're more susceptible to cults. You know it. I know it.
So they initially pose as disguised as this benign exercise group, but then later they say, oh, you through exercise you actually don't need doctors. Actually, modern medicine is a sham. You shouldn't go to the doctors, and if you cultivate your qi, then you shouldn't need to go to the doctor. If you have sickness, that means you haven't cultivated your qi. You haven't practiced enough. And so in 1996, I think this was one of the they were attacked by one of these one of the Chinese media person. They wrote an expose on Falun Gong as a cult. So Falun Gong was very upset. So they organized a huge boycott and protest, trying to shut the publication down. And after the initial success, so anytime there's any criticism of Falun Gong, they will organize a huge protest, try to shut down any media channel that publishes criticism of Falun Gong. But they made a mistake. So I think it's 1995 or 1996. I don't remember exact year. This time again, people were this time the criticism of Falun Gong appeared in official Chinese media channels. I think it was People's Daily or something. So they organized a huge sit-in in Tiananmen, like outside of the compound where the Chinese top leader lived in Zhongnanhai. They organized a huge sit-in protest, and that. Jiang Zemin at the time, the then president of China, Jiang Zemin really didn't like that. So he ordered to have an investigation into the Falun Gong activities. And then they're like, oh yeah, this is a cult. Okay, we're just gonna ban Falun Gong. And after 1990s, Falun Gong had to exit China. They came to the diaspora Chinese population all over the world. But then after 2000, they start to run this multi-million-dollar, if not multi-billion-dollar media empire. And I always wonder, how do they get their money? They spend a lot on advertising. In LA, when I was driving, there's billboards advertising the Shen Yun, the Falun Gong dance. To see the China before communism poster everywhere, right? And then they have they have all these. They have the Falun Gong newspaper, Epoch Time, deliver free to people's door. People who didn't even order them. So I always wonder where they get their funding. So in 2008, one of my friend, independent journalist Yasha Levine, he was writing his book, Surveillance Valleys: The Military Origin of Internet, and he filed a Freedom of Information Act on funding into Falun Gong. It turns out Falun Gong was founded by BBG, the Broadcasting Board of Governors, which is a U.S. government organization. Now they rename it U.S. Media for U.S. Global Media or U.S. Global Media. Hold on, let me. U.S. Agency for Global Media. Guess what other organization the U.S. Agency for Global Media founds? He founds the Voice of America. He founds the Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Liberty, Radio Free Europe.
Oh,
so he founds all these CIA cutout organizations, and they found. Yeah, and they found Falun Gong. So Falun Gong is like one of their most successful pet project. Now I don't think Falun Gong even needs CIA funding at this point, because they're one of the most profitably run media organization in the United States, appealing to the right wing, the U.S. right wing, but also in Europe. They got insanely popular in places like Germany. This is why I say Falun Gong is the most successful Chinese propaganda outfit ever. See, they put CGTN to shame.
On social media and the West, you become the West darling. Your revenue streams must go through the roof. So I'm sure they don't need very much in terms of injection of liquid cash at this point.
You just need seed money.
Exactly. You just need to get started. Especially when you're in these like Radio Frees and Voice of Americas, because they put you right at the front of the algorithm.
Yeah. It's funny because I feel like Westerners didn't really know about Epoch Times, they knew about, I guess some people knew about Falun Gong, like the anti-China activists, but a lot of conservative Americans started loving Epoch Times because they were like, oh, this is real news. And because they were saying everything else is fake news and glowy and astroturf, but this is real news. But it's funny because ever since I was very little, I remember they would always have free Falun Gong newspapers in Chinese at like Asian supermarkets all over America. Where do you get the money for giving free newspapers? I mean, let the Trotskyists know, because they would love to be able to print free newspapers.
Please don't tell the Trotskyists where they're already on Twitter. They have enough access to the internet. We need to restrict their access to the internet and do not tell them about the Epoch Times or the free Falun Gong newspapers, please. Well, I don't know if you guys are ready to wrap, but I think we should do a part 2, because I think we could probably take it all the way to the top of the hour and then some. So let's call it part 1, and then let's do the next one next Friday. Same time, same place?
I can't do next Friday because I'll be on the mainland.
Ooh. Okay, we'll work it out. We'll talk about it. But so where are we at now with Taiwan? Like how do we get to a point? Okay, so Taiwan's like, I feel like Taiwanese people are kind of like, oh, like we're fine. Are you guys all right? To the United States, because the United States is just constantly stirring up drama. And anytime I talk to a mainlander or someone in Taiwan, they're like, no, we're fine. Like everything's fine.
Can you take over, Xiangyu? I really need a bio break.
Oh, we're gonna go soon, Carl. Yeah, go ahead. All right, bye, Carl. We'll see you next week. We'll talk soon.
Well, it's kind of, here's the thing. You know how sometimes in a polite society, there are certain things that everybody knows, but you're just not supposed to say. I can't come up with an example off the top of my head, but I think one example over here in Taiwan was by the 1980s, everybody knew the slogan of Chinese reunification under the 3 principles of the people, which means reunification under the blue sky, white sun, red earth flag, the so-called Taiwanese flag. It's not a Taiwanese flag, by the way. Yeah, people knew that was impossible, but it was not polite to say so. Nowadays, most people know that Taiwan separatism, what they call Taiwan independence, I don't see it as independence, because if you're further embroiled into this US-led world order and you are giving these foreign elites more power over you, that's not independence. But yeah, people know that separatism is unrealistic, and they just don't want to admit it. However, there is one consensus, no matter if you are pro-reunification or separatism here, which is we don't want war. And a lot of people, some people think war is inevitable. Some people think war is only going to become more likely if the administration here keeps on towing the red line and making provocative moves. So are things fine? For the most part, they are. There definitely are troubles, namely the economy here. What's the economy here made up of? You have TSMC for chips, and then you have a bunch of service industry, you have a bunch of restaurants. It's basically deindustrialized. There is an industrial base that was built up, especially in the 70s and 80s, but deindustrialization is happening here just like it's happening in places like Detroit. So now you have a bunch of like white collar workers and like PMC, and you have like the chip industry, and the rest are stuck in low wage.
So is that because of the vassalage to the United States? Because the United States does it to their other vassals in Europe. They deindustrialize it and then kind of centralize it around one sort of economy.
It's capitalism. It's capitalism. Okay. I mean,
it's not just capitalism, because like immediately following World War II, capitalism, it was more of a industrial capital, like the Marshall Plan type capitalism, like building places up. Whereas, okay, well, of course, in other places it was resource extraction, but at that point, degrowth and deindustrialization was not mainstream yet. However, this all changed because people talk about Li Denghui and speak of him as the great liberator who liberalized Taiwan and reintroduced democracy. Yeah, he liberalized politics, but what people don't mention is he also liberalized the economy. You have to remember, Chiang Kai-shek's son, was educated in the Soviet Union. Taiwan's economy was, the growth was at its peak when he was leader from 1978 to 1988. Well, even before then, but officially leader 1978 till 1988. By the way, fun fact, he was classmates with Deng Xiaoping, who also led his part of China from 1978 to around 1988, 89. So for those 10 years, the two sides of the strait were led by classmates. Yeah, Soviet educated, great amounts of protectionism and state planning. There were city run, like municipal run, like credit unions where poor people who wanted to start businesses could go borrow money at low interest rates. Yeah, all of this started getting dismantled in the 1990s after Deng Hui took over.
So not
it's liberal. It's a liberal.
Kind of under their influence.
It's a free market, the liberal free market capitalism.
So it's hell on earth.
1990s. Yeah. I mean, this is also coincided when mainland China opened up its economy. So all the industrialists on Taiwan's like, oh, we can just shift our production to mainland China, where the land and labor is much cheaper, and we make
also Taiwan also deindustrialized to China, just like us. Oh,
yes,
good for
there is
very much like what yields Taiwan today is very similar to the other Western society, like the United States. They just have, but unlike US economy, because of US dollar, right? And at least because New York is still the financial capital of the world. But the Taiwan's sole advantage now is basically TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductors. That, if you look at Taiwan Semiconductor, that actually held up the majority of the Taiwan economy right now. The rest is just service economy. That kind of grew up around.
If you get rid of TSMC, the GDP growth over here is negative.
And United States, guess what United States is doing? United States is trying to get TSMC to move out of Taiwan. United States is pushing for TSMC to build plants in Germany, in United States, anywhere but Taiwan.
I want to make a response to Zhang Wei real quick. The so-called Taiwanese food is just Chinese food. They brought the cuisine from England, no Taiwanese food, Chinese. Okay, yeah, well, there is like localities in China, like just like there is in America, there is like New York style pizza. Okay,
those are Taiwanese style.
There is Taiwanese food. It's just not separate from Chinese cuisine. Just like there's Sichuanese cuisine. Okay, now you can argue that on what is traditionally known as Taiwanese food is a part of a Min cuisine, like the Fujian cuisine, but with all of the different historical things that took place and like the concentration of people from all over the mainland in one small island, that is dominated by southern Fujian people, it does have its distinct food. It's not separate from Chinese cuisine, but it is just as distinct as food in, say, Beijing. Like Beijing's known for their like lamb hot pot, for example. Yeah.
I just like to point out my people contributed to the Taiwan beef noodle. It's
I too am this curious about food and its origins, especially when they talk about cultural cuisine.
A lot of mainland Chinese, when Chiang Kai-shek moved to Taiwan, even in 1949, they were press ganging youth on mainland to go with them to Taiwan. A lot of people were actually involuntarily rounded up and sent to Taiwan. There are a lot of soldiers in the KMT came from my home province, from Sichuan, and they brought the Sichuan beef noodles to Taiwan, but in Taiwan they added a little twist. So the Taiwan beef noodle is not as spicy as it is in Sichuan, but it is developed into a unique Taiwan flavor.
You know, the
started
spicy bean paste.
Korean War, and we've ended up at the evolution of beef noodles across the Asian continent. I love this. This is really good.
Carl,
how do you feel about beef noodles, Xiangyu?
My mom makes the best beef noodle soup.
But Carl says they're not spicy enough.
You can make it spicy. You just have to add more hot chili oil and Sichuan peppercorn. Now,
if you guys want to know more about Taiwanese but Chinese food, follow Xiangyu on Twitter. He's always cooking.
My cooking isn't very like Taiwanese though.
Very like dorm room guy, dorm room bachelor.
Xiangyu can cook Korean food too. Like his family, his grandpa was opened restaurant in Korea, right? Xiangyu.
My grandfather. My grandfather sold jjajangmyeon in Korea after Park Chung-hee passed a bunch of laws that basically. So the Chinese community in Korea was fairly well off, and the post-war Korea was really poor, so they needed to redistribute the wealth. But as you said, South Korea was run by a bunch of collaborators, so they're not going to touch their chaebol. So what did they do? They basically said, okay, foreigners are not allowed in these industries, and all those industries happen to be Chinese dominated. So the Chinese people in Korea were like, oh shit. So all they could basically do was sell the jjajangmyeon, or it's the Sino-Korean version of jjajangmyeon, but in Korea it's made with like black bean paste, and it's a different color, it's a different taste. It's more suitable to Korean taste, but also because of the ingredients that were available at the time. Yeah, it started, I think it was invented in Incheon during the late Qing dynasty. Yeah, there's waves of Chinese migration to Korea, especially towards the end of the Qing dynasty, and most of them came from Shandong province.
Well, Samir Khan would say Taiwanese food is Chinese food, and if you disagree, you're pansexual.
I'm hungry now, man. You guys are making me hungry.
Now I'm hungry. So I think we'll all go. The guys will go with lunch, and I'll go eat midnight ramen. And Xiangyu, why don't you tell us the really good news about your upcoming new show?
Right. So I keep on getting asked questions over the past few years of, oh, where can I learn more about Taiwan? Do you have any more sources? And the unfortunate thing is there's not a lot of resources in the English language. And it's not realistic for me to keep on asking to go on other people's shows to go on my little rants. So I decided, I've been doing this for a while. Why don't I start my own show and see where it goes? So I started my own podcast. It's called Straight Talk with Xiangyu, play on words there. And it goes into a bit of everything. And
you have to explain the play on words to straight, like Taiwan. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
There we
go. Yeah. So the way I frame it is the Taiwan Strait is a pivotal front line between Western hegemony and Eastern resistance. And I would put it on the same level as, let's say, the DMZ in Korea, or I guess Russia and Ukraine right now. Because if you read Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, the biggest fear of American elites, Western elites, is Eurasian civilization overtaking Atlanticist empire. Because for a while, like the Anglo-American empire, how did it become so big? They dominated the seas. That's why the Belt Road Initiative is such a great threat, because it is connecting all of Eurasia and beyond into a singular interconnected trade network that is not only mutually beneficial for all countries, but it goes against the degrowth agenda of finance capital, because finance capital doesn't want competition to rise. That's why they're so hell-bent on attacking China, especially 20. I think 2014 is a very important year, because what happened in 2014? You had the Maidan coup in Ukraine, you had the Hong Kong umbrella movement, you also had the Sunflower movement in Taiwan. Do you think it's a coincidence that all of these happened in the same year, like immediately following like Arab Spring and all of those color revolutions? It was basically after the financial crisis. Yeah, China suffered a little bit, but then it shot back up, and that's when the American elites realized, oh shit, they could actually decouple from us. They're not under our thumb. We really need to smack them back into their place. You can be number two, but you can't surpass number one. So you had this sort of what is it, zero sum mentality on on like on part of the American elites, and China stands for the opposite. And my goal is to tie all of this into this simple fact and let people know that you know the the interests of the common American, the common Westerner, are the same with the interests as the common Chinese people on both sides of the strait. U.S. aid to Taiwan doesn't help the average people. It increases tensions in this region. And real wages have been, even though GDP nominal, real GDP per capita has been rising steadily, real wages here haven't. So people here are getting poorer and poorer unless they're part of the 1%. And you think those billions of dollars that are being sent over here now by that bill passed by Biden are going to benefit the average people here? No, they're going to be used to build up the military. For what? What's the threat is people stirring up tension here. And before people say that, oh, the people in Taiwan are just welfare queens. Actually, no. The government here is a huge welfare queen. I'll give you that. Because you know what? Before this year and these military packages, Taiwan has been strong-armed by the U.S. to purchase outdated weapons from I think every year.
Taiwan buys the Abrams tanks. What the hell are you gonna need Abrams tanks for in Taiwan? You're on an island. When you need, by the time you need Abrams tanks, it's too late.
Yeah, and people are like, oh, amphibious landings are really hard. China's definitely not going to reunify. But it's like, okay, an amphibious landing will be the final chapter of a very long book. And before then, by the time an amphibious landing happens, it already means the forces here are defeated.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
well, maybe they'll drive them around the island. Like Russia does tank races and tank obstacle courses. Maybe
that would be fun. That I support that.
Don't you serve in the Taiwan army? Couldn't you set that up?
I was not in the military. I did substitute service because they decided a few years ago that people born my year and before who hadn't done military service yet would automatically be put in substitute service. So I was at the National Fire Agency's training center, and I was doing admin work there. But every now and then I would put on the fireman suit and go into the combustion chamber and do little cool things like that.
Well, if you could organize these tank races, that you would get at least some use out of your tanks.
Exactly. No, I agree with that. I think
because you won't get any use out of them otherwise.
It can happen after reunification.
Great. So Xiangyu's new show coming up, and Carl, host of Silk and Steel. What's going on the show lately?
I just talk everything about China, history, culture, politics. I actually also do a historical chronological retelling of Chinese history from very beginning. Currently, I'm in 532 BC, so I have a long way to go.
Oh, I think Carl, you've been around for what, 2 or 3 years, and we haven't even gotten to Jesus yet.
No, another 500 years. Sorry.
Be here until Jesus comes back.
right now I'm currently doing like 1 episode per year, so it's going to be like another
Oh, you sound like
533
Dan
episodes
Carlin,
before
who's like,
Jesus.
I do 1 episode every full moon, and it's 6 hours long. That's you. You're the Chinese Dan Carlin. Well, thank you both. We'll do it again when Xiangyu can pencil us in. And congratulations on the new show. I'm really excited. Taiwan does need a voice because you guys are the new playground. And Carl, it's always a pleasure. I'm going to do a reading rainbow moment because this book is what changed my perspectives on the Korean War from a Western lens. Not for Carl or Xiangyu or anybody in Asia. Only Westerners read this book. Carl and Xiangyu will be like, what is this crap? It's for like 5th graders. But yes, guys, read that book. And we are actually having a book club on Twitter, reading Zionism during the Holocaust. Please check out our pinned tweet. And we will see you guys on Monday with the director of the new Assange documentary, Kim Stanton. Carl and Xiangyu, please enjoy your Saturday and have a great weekend. Until next time, guys, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us on.